Hey there! Thanks for checking into this video. My name is Matt Petrowski. I'm a FileMaker developer and the editor over at FileMakerMagazine.com. In this video, we're taking a look at the topic. It's a continuation. We're looking at our user preferences, and this is part 2 of what we started in the previous lessons. Stick with me. We'll be on my desktop in just a few. All right, so for today, we're going to be continuing with our lesson about user preferences and saving those. Yesterday, I gave you an introduction after we also talked about the popover that we fixed. If you found this video as a result of a search or a YouTube suggestion and you're just wondering how can I find video number 1 out of this series? And are there others? Yes, there are other series of videos. Click on the channel icon. Currently, it's down below unless YouTube changes the page. You're going to click on the channel icon. Once you go to my channel, you will be able to see all of the different series of videos that I have there. There's 3 others, including this one, which we're now on, what is this, video number 19, 20? I think we're on 19. Also, if you'd like to follow along in this video with what I'm going to be covering, I provide the file most typically, and you can find that in the description down below. Click on the Show More, and as we will see, the file that I'm going to open up right here, this time track, that's what we're going to be able to follow along with and go through things. Now, just before I do that, I want to mention that the file that I've been developing here, as I show the status area, and what you'll find in this file when we go to the, say for example, the manage layouts, which I just brought up with Command-Shift-L or Alt-Shift-L on Windows, it has a theme within it. It's something that you can use for free where I've styled all of the different objects. And these objects came from a website called FileMakerThemes.com. So check this out.
This video has been brought to you by FileMakerThemes.com. It's a one-stop shop for choosing a theme to apply to your new or existing FileMaker solution. When considering your next move toward advancing the look and feel of your FileMaker solution, don't forget to visit FileMakerThemes.com.
All right, so there you go. There's the pitch for FileMaker Themes. If you need a FileMaker theme, it's a great place to go for a starting point without having to style a whole bunch of objects. There's all kinds of initial styles that you can just start to use, modify, enhance, and basically use it however you'd like. So let's walk through our file here. Now, one thing I've noticed in here, in the file, I have implemented the preferences being saved, and that's what we're going to walk through, how it's working in this file. And I think I've explained this enough in terms of the way that I like to store my preferences for this type of file. But one of the things that I noticed is when I make a selection here and I modify, notice that down here in the bottom we're getting this issue where the total is no longer displaying. Now that happens because FileMaker, as it has moved forward throughout the past, I'd say 5 years, well, ever since FileMaker, the FileMaker 12 format came into existence, FileMaker has been making a lot of changes behind the scenes in order to make FileMaker much more efficient on mobile, because mobile obviously has a processor that isn't as fast as what we have on desktop here. So FileMaker has this particular script step, and I'm going to go into the script that we've been working on, this on object save load times. This is the same script that's attached to this popover and also to the 2 buttons that are, drop-down menu or pop-up menu. I forget what it is. I always say that too. I don't know why. The popover, when you click on either of those buttons, it's running this exact same script. Now, the issue is when we get to the bottom of this script, or we scroll down here and take a look at this, you can see one of the things that we're doing at the bottom is we are refreshing objects. And in this case, it's the 2 buttons that are in that popover, the option to omit and then the option to exclude start times. Well, FileMaker has a function, a couple of them. In fact, let's go, I want to make this so that we can see it a little bit better. So I am going to scroll that up, and I'm just going to put in a step here just to put it in. I'm going to start to type refresh. And we're going to talk about these 3 different steps, steps right there. refresh object, refresh portal, and refresh window. Now, refresh window is a step that has been in FileMaker for a long time. And what refresh window does is refresh window attempts to walk across everything that's on the layout. All objects that are on the layout get some type of attention paid to them, but this comes at a cost. FileMaker, I don't know if this happens, but when you refresh the window and it hits, say, for example, a field that is an unstored calculation, it may be recalculating that. I don't know if that's part of the refresh, but I do know that with regards to the refresh, refreshing the whole window is more costly than just refreshing individual items on your FileMaker layout, especially when it comes to FileMaker Go and working on mobile, because the processor isn't as powerful as a desktop machine. Because when it was of little consequence, we could afford to just throw in a refresh window whenever we wanted. Well, now we have to pay much more attention as FileMaker developers of what needs our attention. And so in this case, when I'm calling these refresh objects, that's obviously causing me a problem with the total down at the bottom in terms of it refreshing. It happens to be a sub-summary field, so I'm going to add an additional refresh object in order to see if I can fix that. And you can do the same thing in your file because your file doesn't have it as well. The refresh portal and the refresh object, these are two recent additions within, I'd say, refresh portal maybe within the last two versions. If it's not 15, maybe 14, but I know that refresh object has probably been either 13 or 14. So portal is when you want to refresh, obviously, a portal, and object is when you want to refresh anything that really isn't working the way that it should. So I'm going to name this object right here of, I'm going to call it, again, what I do is, I go between these two. It's a text block that's on the layout, but it's a text block that's showing a merge field. That field happens to be a sub-summary, or excuse me, a summary field, not a sub-summary. So sometimes I put summary as I started to type there, and then most of the time I use text. And I'll put in total time. And again, the best thing to do is always, once you put it in once somewhere, just copy and paste it so that you really won't get things incorrect. So we select our object right here. I go to the inspector and I zoom in, and I am going to paste that right there so that this object is tied to that name, and that is getting refreshed when I perform those steps, which is causing this to not display properly. And let's see if that fixes that. I do want to save those changes. I'll zoom out here, and now I'll go make those and see what happens. Something's still going on that's funky there with regards to that. Okay, let's try another thing. And you know what? What we are doing here in terms of this refresh object and all of these different things, I have to be honest with you. FileMaker, because they stay consistent with a lot of their legacy system by not changing a whole lot that forces you to change a whole lot in your solution, for example, dropping functions or changing what functions do. It's one of the benefits to FileMaker, but it's also one of the downsides, is we're getting more and more display issues, I've noticed, within FileMaker. And so one of the things that could be happening right now is the script it could be this one right here. Really, in order to test this, I have to come in and hide certain script steps in order to find out what is causing the problem here with this not updating. So I'll temporarily hide that, and then I'll go run the same thing. This is a lot of the annoying parts. Look at that. That's it. That script that I had added with regards to saving preferences is our problem in terms of this not displaying. Now, I have no idea why FileMaker does this in some particular cases, but I do know what the solution typically is. By simply hiding that, what we're going to be taking a look at today, it fixed that for some reason. If I turn that on, that's going to be my problem. So ultimately, this wasn't needed, refreshing that object. And again, this is normal part of FileMaker development. When FileMaker starts to behave weirdly or does something that you don't expect, you have to find out where and why. And a lot of the times in our scripts, we don't necessarily know why, but I'm going to fix this save preferences, which is what we're going to look at quickly here. I am going to, that's probably why. we're going to walk through this and we're going to not only solve this display issue, but we're going to talk about our preferences. So we'll add this. It's a little bit of a teaser towards the end of the video. What step should I put right after the set field? That's what we're going to find out. All right, so let's take a look at our preferences. So as I stated in the previous video, if you didn't watch that, go back and watch it. One of the concerns that we have is we want to make sure, as I go to my Manage Layouts and I expose in my developer list of layouts, these are the things helpful to me to be able to see what's going on. We open our users table. I'll click on the open button down here. We discussed the fact that I am storing the preferences here within a given field. And I'm storing these preferences in a format that is all just text. In fact, I just got a comment on one of my other videos that said, the stuff you are teaching is not beginner. It's not even close. And true, this may not be super beginner, but please don't make this more difficult than it is. The only thing that I'm storing in this field is text. It's just text that's formatted in a way that FileMaker already likes. That's simple. That's not hard. I would presume that a beginner can understand that that's what this is. And my apologies if you are a beginner, and it seems like I'm being a little bit harsh here, but this is just a field, and I'm putting data in this field, and the data happens to be in the format that a let function likes. So let's see what happens. The first thing that we need to do is we need to, upon startup, we need to read this value. Now, we already know that this solution is starting up on a dedicated layout. It is starting up on this layout called startup, and that's tied to a table occurrence called startup. So let's open up the startup. It's going to be really blank and plain right now. Typically, I put a nice little graphic in this. It acts as my splash screen. It's a nice introduction to the solution. It's a low-impact startup. It loads no records. It's only got one, I believe. We'll only ever have one. Great way to start up. I've got another video here on YouTube. You can go look for that. It's called Startup Splash Screen, I believe. I'm checking my audio here, making sure it's good and coming through. All right, so when we look at our relationship graph, and we know that from having set this to our startup, the startup layout being this startup occurrence, we know that this is the startup occurrence. So once we land on this, we have access to the user data. So that field value of preferences is accessible from the very first time that FileMaker opens, because it opens, it lands on a layout. That layout is tied to this table occurrence. This table occurrence can look into the user table, and it can see that preferences field. So let's start with that first. We are going to go to our scripts. I'll hide that window, and we'll go back to our script workspace in the background here. Notice that I have a folder called Startup. This is my folder that contains all of my scripts relevant to the startup process. The primary startup script, the script that is being called from the file options, if you don't know where those are, we'll do a quick refresher here. We go to, with the file selected, we go to the File menu. We go to the File Options. There is only one possibility. In the script triggers, we have the On First window open. It is tied to that startup script. That's all I'll say. This script runs when the file opens. Exactly what we want. This script, in the rest of the computing world, in the rest of, as long as operating systems have been in existence, and software as well, what they call this process typically, or what I'm familiar with it being called, is called bootstrapping. This is when, at the very beginning or the startup of a file, you do all of the things that need to be done in your startup process so that you can put the database or the software ready into the state that the user's able to start to work with it. Now, that can include a lot of different things, and you can see the first thing we're doing is we're checking for the user. Are they in the users table? I talked about that previously. Go reference that video. I talked about logging. We're logging the fact that the user did log into the system, which captures the time that they came in, and we can also log when they come out. The next thing we're going to do is we are going to restore their preferences, meaning the last time they were in the database, when they had those options checked or any other options, what is it that we want to restore. So let's look at the restore preferences. The restore preferences, and notice again, when I call these, we're in intermediate stage. When I call these beginner and intermediate videos, if you go through all of these scripts one by one, you'll notice that a lot of them do not have anything more than 6 steps or 7 steps. This is our most complex script in the whole database thus far. So I don't know. I just consider the stuff beginner for some reason, or early intermediate. The restore preferences. Let's talk about what it does. And let's hide my steps over here. All right, so the first step is really easy to understand. The first thing, we already know that we have set the file to open up on that table occurrence that is the startup table. So context in this situation is very important. We can see that when we click on specify and we go to our manage database so we can look at our graph, we start up on this table occurrence. It can see into our startup users. So that is our startup this is our context, but this is what that context can see. It can see into the users table, and it's doing it based on their username. It's looking at that value of startup preferences. So we are capturing that, whatever's in that field, and we know that it's just a bunch of text. It's strings formatted as the internal portion of a let statement. We take that value and then we wrap it and make it legitimate FileMaker code. So you can see right here that we have another variable called code, and we look at that, and this is all that it's doing. It is simply saying, I am going to turn the contents of that field, which I know matches what I already would be able to use inside a let statement. It's the same thing as if I had typed what's in that field right here in the calculation dialog box. So by wrapping around what would be a valid FileMaker function, I'm now able to take advantage of the one function that allows me to basically evaluate any FileMaker code that comes from anywhere. And there's a lot of tricks that I use with regards to this particular methodology. You can put data into a field, and as long as it's valid in terms of I can interpret this as code, FileMaker, then it will interpret it, and it will do what you want it to do. I also use blocks of text in the non-visible portion of a layout in order to store code. You can store code anywhere where you can put text. It's plainly that simple. Your code for your FileMaker solution does not only have to exist within a calculation dialog box. Your code can exist anywhere, and that's a fundamental key concept for anybody who wants to become an advanced FileMaker developer. It can come from a field, it can come from a text block, it can come from a MySQL database, it can come from a completely separate data that you connect to. So what this is saying is create a let statement and take the contents that I have intentionally stored into a field as variables that are going to be declared, in this case, global variables, so that when those are declared, they are created in memory. And that's what happens. The very last step, and there's only 3 of them, is we are going to set a variable of the result. Now, this one does get a little bit confusing unless and until you look at the evaluation error function. Now, what this does is the evaluation error, when you look at the comments for it, all that it does is it returns a yes or no, a true or false, based on this function of evaluate. So I could, in this situation, have just that. Now, what happens is this. If the values that I had stored within the field of the preferences, if they were not valid FileMaker code, if I stored it and for some reason I missed a semicolon, or I formatted a variable using characters that are not allowed, like the plus sign or the minus sign, anything that FileMaker could accidentally interpret as an operator, and that's one thing you need to know, what are legitimate values for use in a variable name, meaning either this, variable within a script, or this, a global variable? Well, pretty much limit yourself to these. Alphanumeric characters, that's all of your numbers plus all of your alpha characters, the underscore, and the period. That's what I do. So pretty much those are the only things that I ever use for a variable name as such. Is like that, and that's it. And I can have my numbers, and I can use lowercase, but you know that from watching my videos, I differentiate upper versus lower with regards to the scope of the variable. A global variable, meaning accessible to all scripts at all times, as long as FileMaker is running, is the $$, and the single $sign is a local script variable. We'll have to get into that more. So if this was bad, if the code that's coming from the field, which is that omit and the other thing, if it evaluated and it was incorrect, what FileMaker will return is it will return this right here. When FileMaker can't do something, FileMaker's standard result is a question mark. So in this case, this would actually evaluate sort of the same way with the evaluation error, but the evaluation error, when you read its description in the documentation, and I won't go into it right now, it is simply turning a true or false as to whether or not FileMaker had a problem. So if I evaluate that code coming from the field and it could not evaluate and it did return a question mark, then this would basically say it didn't evaluate successfully, which is the same thing as saying this right here. Evaluation error. If you had a problem doing this, evaluating this code, then you're going to result in either a 1 or 0. So knowing that, we could put in the rest of our calculation, or our scripting code right here, we could put something like this: if not result. And then at this point, you could do whatever you want to do. You could send yourself an email. You can show a dialog box to the user. You can take the user to another layout. You can do whatever you want if it wasn't successfully read. And a lot of the times, this is critical to do. This is called error handling, and it's something that is learned oftentimes much later in a new learner's development career, but it's something that you should learn from the very outset, is how to do error handling. And we'll have to talk about that in a different video at a different time. So right now, this does not have error handling on, so I would consider this, this is non-defensive coding right now, because I haven't helped myself out by saying if there is an error, then I need to show something, but I'm keeping this simple so that we can understand the concepts. So let's walk through this. Let's see what happens. First, this is how we're going to test it. We're going to put ourselves in the context upon which it happens. That is the startup window. So you need to open the startup window and operate or execute a script within the context under which it needs to happen. We'll also add one other thing to this script. In this script, we are going to add one step at the bottom, and that is simply just going to be an exit script step. Now, why? The reason is if the last step right here is a set variable and we use the debugger, we won't be able to see what the result of that variable is. The script will just quit. It'll just finish out and the debugger will go away. So for those scripts that are just variable setting, things where you're just moving things around in memory, each of these are values that are stored in memory. Putting this step last helps us out and allows us to see the result of what's happening. So what we're going to do here is we are going to emulate the process of startup. We could just shut down the file and then reopen it with the debugger and look at it, but I want you to know that you can debug without having to go through that process of shutting the file down and then reopening the file. So we go up, we can do this in a couple of different ways. You have to have FileMaker Advanced. You can invoke the debugger right here, or you have the option within the scripting workspace to click this button right here, or you have the option to run the script right there. You can run the script without the debugger, or if you hold down the modifier key of Command-Shift-R, you can debug this script as you look at it. So we've got our proper context. We now can click on that debug icon or do Command-Shift-R, which is what I'm going to bring up right here. We'll have the script workspace forward, Command-Shift-R. It brings up the script, and we can now see what is going to happen or what the startup process happens when it loads. We do want to show the data viewer. This is another way of simply doing this right here, data viewer. So I will do that one right there so that we can see what's going on when the script is running. And we'll see it side by side here. So we are going to step through this script. And I know I haven't talked about this at length, all of the different parts. We'll have to go through that. But we are going to do this one right here, this F6 step into. So we're going to see preferences right there. Preferences got loaded. What is it? We can always double click over here and take a look. Oh, it just read the string, the contents, just text from the field. And it's in the proper format. One of the things you come across with a let function is if you have an extra semicolon, that is code that will fail. And it's a good idea to make your scripts intentionally fail in order to find out what you need to put in order to solve that problem. However, in this case, I'm not going to do that. So what's the next thing? The next thing is it's going to make another variable, and it's going to simply put this into a valid code format. So we advance that one. All right, let's go look at that. So we open up. Oh, okay, so it says this is valid FileMaker code. Let, yep, it's got the parenthesis, it's got the open bracket. Omit is going to be equal to 1. Exclude starts is going to be equal to 0. We're resulting with a value of true because the result in this case really doesn't matter. We could put true here, false here, a double set of quotes to be empty. We don't care about the result of this let function. We are only using this let function for the purpose of creating these variables and storing those values. This is called instantiation, or we are instantiating these variables. So what is the result? If we evaluate this and look at the evaluation error, do we get a result? Now here's the confusing thing. In all of FileMaker and the rest of the computing world, Linux, Unix in particular, with most of the binary tools that are provided in Linux, Unix, we are thinking in terms of Boolean values. And when we think in terms of Boolean values, we're thinking a 0 is false and a 1 is true. And so your thinking or your thought process in this situation may be, was there an evaluation error? And in this case, it works out properly. If we ask the question, was there an evaluation error, we get the response of false. There was no evaluation error. But in other areas of FileMaker, that type of thinking when you're looking at the function sometimes won't work. It'll be the reverse, and you'll be thinking, why am I getting a 0 result? Because the way that this works is if you get a 0 and you get no error, then everything's all good. If you do get an error, then that's going to be a positive result of all of the different possibilities of errors. There could be thousands of them. And FileMaker has an error list, and we will get into that at a different time. But in this case, a 0 is good. There was no error in terms of this code being evaluated, and that means that the variables were set. This variable was set, and this variable was set, and that happens in the blink of an eye on startup. Easy deal. And that's what happens on startup. So let's zoom out. Let's continue with our script. Everything's working great there now. All we have to think about now is what I talked about in yesterday's video. In yesterday's video, we talked about what is the best way to store these values and the fact that we have an issue that if we wait until the very end, if we wait until the application is going to close down to get all of our individual variables, we risk the downside of none of the preferences having been saved if FileMaker crashes before that time. So the preferred method is to, at the point in time that a preference is changed, to save it right then. So notice that in my scripts, I have this folder called Startup, where everything that deals with Startup is probably going to go in this folder. But then I also have a folder called Shared. Now the Shared folder means that this is shared across the whole solution. Any layout can use any script that's in the shared folder, and none of the scripts in this folder should have anything specific to context, meaning they should be able to work everywhere. Whereas in the rest of my solution, I have a user interface with each layout getting its own dedicated folder. that means that these scripts presumably can, they might not, operate within the context of this layout. It's just the type of organization and separation that I use in my FileMaker solutions. So save preferences happens to be a context-specific script. Unfortunately, we can make this script non-context specific, but I'm not going to show you that right now. I'll probably be discussing that in my advanced scripting session with lessons, which I'm trying to develop now as we go along. So, and here's the difference. I'm not going to hide this from you. This is the function that you will be using in order to abstract from context. But for new FileMaker learners, abstraction becomes a difficult concept. First, save preferences would have to have a value inbound that lets the script know what is the current context when it could operate in multiple different contexts, meaning on a different layout, what that layout sees according to what's wired up on the graph can be completely different than running the same script somewhere else. But this is the reason why it's in this shared folder. This script will ultimately become context independent instead of being dependent on a specific context. This is dependent on a specific context. Whenever you use set field anywhere in any script, you are establishing a dependency on the context upon which this script can operate. If you use set field by name and how you use it, it is possible to separate or break this script out from context. And that's about the best I can say right now on that. Don't want to confuse you too much, but if you don't get the concept of context, you'll have to go back to some of my previous videos where I talk about it in depth. So this context-specific set field is saying quite simply this. And if you remember yesterday's lesson, I wanted to do something like this, set variable, and I wanted the variables to be really overt. Omit invoiced is one of them. And then I wanted to have another one. And I wanted to be able to see right here when I open this, what are the variables that I'm tracking that I care about in this solution? Well, I couldn't think of a really good way to do this because the primary problem that we hit in this scenario, as I told you in the previous video also, that when you're going to change out a variable, you either have to do one of two things. You either have to write really complex logic that is going to say, do you have the omit invoiced in there? Okay, if you do, using a pattern count, I need to substitute that value out. Well, now I need to substitute the value out, and that means I have to not just get the name of omit invoiced with the double dollar signs, but I have to include the equal sign and the value that's after it and the semicolon. Now, I can read everything up to the semicolon and the paragraph return, in fact, in the list of the variables, and I can get rid of that and then append the new value after that. But sometimes you have to think, is that more hassle than it's worth? Is that more code than I need to deal with? And in this case, I figured it was. And so I got rid of those and I just said, this is what we're going to do. I am going to use just a single set field. And no matter what, this one set field is always going to write all preferences into the preferences field. Now, this could grow to be quite large. This could grow right here where it becomes this. I have a bunch of them. But really, it's not that bad in terms, this is nothing. This is the blink of an eye for FileMaker in order to set all of these values. And here's how it works. We are simply saying, FileMaker, I want you to use the list function. Now, the list function is simply just going to be a list of however many values you want. It turns out that FileMaker has to have at least two. So I can have one value and I can have two values. I can't just have one. I have to have, it basically wants two. List also works across fields and across relationships in order to get a list of values of related records. But it can also work with specifically literal values. And what's really nice about the list function is you can include however many items you want, and those items can be anything that you want. They can be a literal string, which is what this is. They can also be a field reference, where you have a field. They can also be a variable. They can also be a global variable, and pretty much any combination thereof. So because of that, you can see what I am doing up at top here. Pay extra special attention to the fact that even though this is here 2 times, this is a literal string. It is a string that says the omit invoiced is going to be equal to whatever is currently in the variable omit invoiced. So it's ending up where it's omit invoiced is equal to 1 or 0, and exclude starts is equal to 1 or 0. Now there's a kicker here that you need to be aware of. In my implementation currently, we are only using numerical values. And in a let statement, within the inside of it, a numerical value can exist without quotes. If this particular value stored in this global variable was a string, then you would need to make sure and use this function right here, quote, right there, because you need to, let me hide that, you need to make sure that you are wrapping the quotes and making it valid FileMaker code. It has to be valid internal portion of a let statement. In other words, a let statement, fmlet var, would look like this. If I put in a literal value, it would have to be within quotes. So if I'm going to supply the contents of a variable, then I have to make sure that that is going to have quotes. There are 2 ways to do that. I can wrap the quotes around it using the quote function, or I can concatenate the quotes literally. That would look like this. That would be, I want to, and it's, the quote function is easier, but the quote function, you have to be aware, can mess up some of the contents what's in a variable. So you have to read up on the quote function, see what the quote function is going to do, because it will convert other things doing what's called escaping. But here's the literal way that you would do this. You would put a double set of quotes. You would use the concatenation operator, meaning this item right here is glue. It's glue that's gluing these 2 things together. I'm going to then glue this to a double set of quotes. So currently I'm gluing nothing being glued to whatever is the contents of that global variable being glued, concatenation, to nothing. But in this case, I want quotes to wrap around this, so I have to escape a quote. Anytime that you hear the word about escaping characters in FileMaker, it is simply a matter of preceding that value, that character, with a backslash. And the reason for this is FileMaker interprets this quote as the start of a string. But if FileMaker sees that there is a backslash and then a quote, FileMaker says, this isn't the start of a literal string. What this is instead is you wanting me to give back a quote character. So the reason that this is a little more convoluted is because looking at this code isn't nearly as convenient as looking at the code when you just use the quote. And again, you need to read up on the quote function in order to determine if it's going to work for your needs. Because if the contents of your variable does have certain characters that are specific to FileMaker, and those are characters like the ampersand, embedded double quotes, etc., it will convert those values. In fact, what's the best way to play with FileMaker? Open up the data viewer, create a watch variable, and then put in contents and see what you get as a result. See what functions do by playing with them. So, what may seem complex and convoluted and definitely not beginner-related stuff, this is still pretty straightforward. Let me get rid of this. We are simply saying, when this script is called, we are going to intentionally set into a field all of our preference variables. And our preference variables are these that we want to save. And that's all that it's doing. We are doing one additional thing here. We are putting this into a proper let format. What is the proper let format? The proper let format is that we'll have var1, and then we will take this and we will have var2 to do that right there. Whatever this is right here, you cannot have this trailing semicolon right there. That's not valid. FileMaker will not accept that because it needs to have no trailing semicolon for the last item. So this substitute, what it is doing is the list function puts everything in just a return delimited list. Each item that you list right here is on its own line. And it only has a paragraph return after each of the items except for the last one. So what we're doing is we're saying we want to use the substitute to replace all paragraph returns at the end of each line that has a paragraph return with a semicolon and then putting the paragraph return back. And what happens is the last one will not get a semicolon. So we will end up with this right here, which is the valid internal portion of a let statement stored as a string in a field. And hopefully that explanation is simple enough so that it makes sense, because in terms of the simplicity of saving user preferences, I don't know that you can get much more simple than this. This is a total of 4 steps in total between 2 scripts in order to save preferences. And all you have to do is come in and modify this and just keep adding all of the preferences that you want to save each time that you want to save. It currently is context dependent because of that set field, but we can now finally wrap this video up and see what was the problem of this rendering down at the bottom, what I left you with. It is this right here. I'm going to change our 2 scripts with only 4 steps in total to, well, that's excluding the exit script that we have on this step, to this right here. This is what's needed. Anytime that you use a set field when you are scripting, if you don't put a bow on it and wrap things up by saying, FileMaker, flush this to the database and then update your user interface for any fields or values that need to be updated, then you get that display. The reason the summary field is not displaying when we do the find is because at the end of the find script, our loading script, we are calling this set preferences, and the set preferences is just setting a field, but it's leaving FileMaker in this like, I'm just sitting here, I'm waiting for you to add more data state. Until you give it the commit and basically flush things, then that little display won't ever happen. Now I am changing this with dialog off because when I'm going to script things, if the commit, this deals with transactions, if the user ever turned on, no, the user can't turn it on. If you as the developer turned on the option on the layout so that that layout did work in a transactional method, which you probably won't, turning the dialog off, meaning I never want to see your dialog FileMaker when you commit, is what you need to do. So everything should be working now. And the way that we test this out is we close everything up. We select on our project 7, we've got our settings, we omit, and this is refreshing perfectly each time that I do this. I have chosen to keep both of these options on. I can close the database. I can now open the database, going to my recent and go back to my database. And when I open the database, FileMaker currently is not returning my full state. My full state, and if you want to put this in, we can. My full state would be, I was looking at project number 7. So that's a preference. What was the user looking at? Can I return them to the exact same layout and the exact same found set of project 7? Well, FileMaker's loading all of the records, but what FileMaker did do as a result of the startup is it saved my preferences. So omit invoiced for me as a user has been saved. It was read from my field and it's right here so that when I make this selection, I get exactly what I was looking at the previous time. And the preferences are saved and we've accomplished our goal with that. Now all we'd have to do is sort of enhance our preferences and just expand this out. Make sure that we are returning the user to the project that they were looking at, returning the user to the layout they were looking at, Heck, in FileMaker, one of the things you'll notice is that if you don't save the window orientation, FileMaker's window will come up wherever the last user closed a window or whatever size that window was. So it's always nice to just make your FileMaker database come up exactly where the user was looking at it with the exact data with all of the options, and that's when you're creating a really nice piece of software with FileMaker. All right, 45 minutes, a little bit long today, but let's see if we have any questions. I think I've got one that came in. We will see if it switches over there, and got that little artifact until I bring up my feedback and my comments. All right, so we've got all of our morning highs. It is hard to follow live, but they can review the lesson over and again. Yes, I'm only doing this live out of convenience to me and anyone who does have a question. If you need to watch these lessons again, I promise you, you will learn a lot by going through these. And once it clicks and you understand what's happening and then the why behind it's being done that way, you're then creating advanced FileMaker software. You're doing it. So even if you're a beginner, don't say, I can't understand this. Just watch it again. Sometime one record's font is lesser and another's higher. When you say font, are you referring to, I'm assuming you're referring to the typeface, and one record's font is lesser and another's is higher. Are you talking about the font size? Meaning this right here, the difference between these two? I'm not quite sure. You might need to clarify on that. Font size is 12, but on some records shown not following the formatting of that portal format. Remember, if you're having font issues and it's because of a copy and paste, you can always use FileMaker's text formatting functions in order to remove the text formatting if that's an issue. See if that's the case. We did have a question come in here. Otherwise, I'm not exactly clear on that question. Jean-Pierre asked a question, why let and not set variable? We could use multiple set variables in order to cycle through those. The difficulty is, in order to set a variable, you can use a set variable of omit invoiced being equal to the value of omit invoiced. For me, I like to manage things within an internal portion of a let statement because it allows me to just type and edit that code really quickly. I can do find and replace across it, but if you like to figure out a way where you can put those individual set variables, and it makes the script easier to read, then use that method if it works for you. This is just one that I happen to be using for me. Thank you for joining in from Greece. I think that's all of our questions that we had for today, just a few of them. Hopefully this content has helped you out. Again, check out FileMaker Themes if you're interested in a theme for FileMaker and you want to get going fast. It'll save you hours and hours of time. Of course, you can also check out my content over at FileMakerMagazine.com. I've got a really cool video coming up, advanced, but we're talking about converting the contents of a web viewer into a PDF on the client side, meaning we don't have to use FileMaker's PDF generation, and it's fast. And that's what I'm covering on the magazine site. So thank you, Elder, and for the rest of you, this is our wrap out, or our wrap up, or our wind out, whatever you want to call it. So you can subscribe here on YouTube. If you have an account, the mobile app will notify you. It's wonderful, and the next video in this series will come up right here. As always, over at the magazine and here as well, I wish you much luck with your own FileMaker development, and until next time, happy FileMaking to you. Bye-bye.